Good afternoon or good evening. Uh, Actually, good morning to you, Mr. Fidel Amake, or should I call you Mr. Owusu? And
Everything
to
is
our
any of
audience,
them is fine. Yeah.
yeah, and to our audience, I would like to thank you for participating in the Nzuri Kahawa Report. This is going to be our first report and our first podcast, and I specifically chose Mr. Owusu because I am originally from East Africa, and I'm quasi familiar with what's happening in the Horn of Africa, but also I'm interested in what's happening in West Africa in terms of regional politics, geoeconomics, geopolitics, but also regional and international players in that domain. And so, Mr. Wusu, I give the floor to you so you can introduce yourself to the public.
Yeah. So I am the Chief Executive Officer of DevSec Analytics Africa Limited, a consultancy firm focused on geopolitics, security risk assessment, and deals or covers all the 6 geopolitical zones in Africa. We have associates all over the continent. And we also do how or look at how external actors or decisions of external actors influence the region. So if you are a firm, a mining firm, NGO, or any other company interested in investing in Africa or interested in being present in Africa, we are in position to provide you with the necessary assessment, risk assessment that gives you heads up on what is likely to take place in the weeks and months ahead of you. That is very important. Again, I have worked for Riley Risk, a risk management company, for about a year and over. And I just left Riley Risk recently. And I'm also a consultant for Unival GmbH, a German manufacturer of security equipment that is primarily focused on border security and other security equipment. I have also served as a senior conflict analyst for the Conflict Research Consortium for Africa, a consortium based in Nigeria, and where I have provided training for young analysts and other analysts interested in knowing the dynamics in Africa, and so on and so forth. I have granted several interviews to international media houses, and I'm quite prolific on LinkedIn, where I provide summaries on security issues in Africa. I do more, but then I think that for the sake of time, I would like this to be my profile. Yes.
Yeah. So, Mr. Wusu, thank you for joining us on the Nzuri Kahawa Report. And for our own online audience, Nzuri Kahawa means good coffee in Swahili. Uh, so, uh, and So we have 1 hour to discuss fragile states in Africa and the evolution of non-state actors, especially in West Africa and the Sahel region. And maybe if we have time, we can touch a light touch on East Africa as well. So before diving into our specific countries and non-state actors, let's begin with broad questions. But also, before I give you the broad question, I would like to share a small story on why actually I decided to start the podcast in the first place. And I went to college and I went to Texas A&M University, and I have a good friend of mine who went to UT, University of Texas, the second best university in Texas. And we were talking about Mozambique, and we were talking about Al Shabaab specifically, and he's extremely intelligent individual, and we were talking about that particular region, and he did not know where Mozambique was located at all. He had zero idea. And then afterwards, he started researching on it. And then I met actually a good friend of mine from Nigeria that at one point he asked me where I was from, and I told him I was from Eritrea. He looked at me puzzled. Where's that at exactly? But I'm pretty sure that East Africans feel the same way about West Africa. If you tell them where Benin or Togo is located, they will look at you if you're located between Mars and Jupiter. So therefore, that was my culminating effect on why I wanted to start a podcast. I wanted to bring West Africans, North African, East Africans, Central Africans, Southern Africans to actually talk about the continent itself, and the challenges at hand. And I guess going straight to question number one, it's going to be a very broad question in order to, I guess you can put it this way, give us a glimpse, not only to me, but also to the viewers, but also to our international viewers who have limited knowledge on that particular region. So according to the 2024 Global Terrorism Index report, the epicenter of terrorism shifted from Middle East to from North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and particularly in the Sahel region, which now accounts for nearly half of all terrorism activity-related deaths globally. So, and you were talking about timeline as the next epicenter for terrorism. So, in your view, what is the timeline for African continent becoming the next epicenter for terrorism, potentially surpassing Middle East in scale and severity? So we've seen countries like, for example, Iraq, Syria, Yemen become failed states and battleground for regional international actors. So currently, Somalia, Sudan, and Libya are bandwagoning behind those states in the Middle East. And so the three African countries are mirroring the dynamics in those Arab countries. From a broader perspective, Africa comprises of 54 different countries, boasts a landmass 3 times the size of the United States. So to give a concept to the international viewer, so to put this in perspective as well, not necessarily to me or you, but to the viewer, you can put the United States, China, India, Eastern Europe, Portugal, Spain, Belgium, France, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, Japan, and UK inside Africa. So I want people to have an overview of how actually big Africa is in terms of landmass. And so given its size, diversity, and the challenges, do you believe Africa's vast geography and fragile state systems will make it more challenging environment for counterterrorism than the Middle East?
Thank you very much for this question. It's, as you mentioned earlier, it's broad. Now, in respect of West Africa, this has a long history, but we would like to take it from about a decade ago, somewhere 2012. Now, in 2011, the Gaddafi regime was removed from power, and Gaddafi eventually died from that particular operation that was led by NATO. Now, after that, we saw proliferation of arms and the activities of rogue actors in the Sahel. But sometimes when you mention the Sahel, many people do not get a scoop of the Sahel, and that is very important to explain. Now, the Sahel stretches from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Red Sea. And so mostly people misconstrue that to be only in West Africa. No, the Sahel is actually a belt that stretches across Africa. And it is made up of very important countries like Senegal, Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan, and even some part of Eritrea. And in fact, with that vegetation, the vegetation is semi-arid. So it is very open. And so it makes the movement of actors very, unhindered. And the activities, economic activities in the Sahel has been pastoral life, the rearing of animals, because the vegetation is short grass that is good for animals. That also comes with a very unreliable weather condition, because sometimes it gets that the region experiences drought, and that creates a lot of economic stress for the populations. But most importantly, beneath the soil of the Sahel are very important resources like oil, gold, and other resources like the uranium, strategic resources like uranium. And so it makes the Sahel a very important belt. So back to Libya. Libya lies in the Sahara zone. And so in the vegetation of Africa, you have the Mediterranean vegetation, you come to Sahara, then Sahel, then to Savannah, then you move to the forest belt in the middle of Africa. So the Sahel is sandwiched between the Sahara and the Savannah. And these countries that are found there happen to face various vulnerabilities. So when the issue of the post-Gaddafi Libya, which lies in the Sahara, led to the proliferation of arms. So rogue actors got access to arms. But most importantly, there had been a long civil war in Algeria. And the remnants of Islamists in Algeria created what we call Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. That was a turning point in jihadism or extremism in Africa or sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the creation of Akim somewhere in the early 2000s led to what we call the exportation of global terrorism in West Africa. And they use, as part of their sources of funds, they traded in cigarettes, they controlled illicit trade routes in order to fund themselves. So, in Mali, we also had what we call the Tuareg nationalism. This happened even before independence. And Mali is one of the largest landlocked countries in Africa. Now, the Tuareg are a unique people that have always sought their independence, but it all fell on deaf ears. The French ignored them, and post-independence Mali government also ignored them. And sometimes such requests for independence or autonomy were met with brutality. And so over time, they seem to have armed themselves. And when the Gaddafi era, post-Gaddafi era came and there was proliferation of weapons, it meant that they had access to more arms. But unfortunately, within the Tuareg nationalism, we also found a spectrum that had Islamist extremism also emerging. And so a group emerged called Ansar Dine, and Ansar Dine led by a notorious Tuareg man known as Iyad Ag-Ghali, who led that nationalism or that Islamism. And they found an ally in Akim, as I've mentioned earlier, in Algeria. And they came together and started unleashing one of the worst terror attacks in the region. And so in 2012, 2013, they had captured central Mali and northern parts of northern Mali. And the ancient city of Timbuktu in Mali was also captured. And before Islamic State was created in the Middle East in 2014, this Ansar Dine and Akim measure had already created its mini Islamic State in central Mali. So the creation of Islamic State did not just happen in Syria and Iraq. It actually started in West Africa. That was the first time a terror group was known to have captured territory and was administering Sharia law in its extreme form on a territory. And that was very unprecedented. So it took the French and West African forces to actually protect other cities in Mali and Niger from being run over by these miscreants and extremists. Now, eventually, when French forces and ECOWAS forces or West African forces decided to quench that kind of test of the terrorists to kill and to plunder, it brought to a halt the kind of alacrity and the kind of speed that they were moving with. But that did not end there, because then you needed long-term solutions, because there was Tuareg nationalism mixed with Islamism. And we had this Algerian Islamists as well. That was quite unprecedented for a region that was largely stable and in the past had only experienced political instability. Apart from political instability, the region was largely stable. But this new strand of threat actually changed the dynamics in the region. And despite some stability in 2014, 2015, by 2017, these guys had regrouped and formed what they called the JNIM, Movement for the Protection of Islamists or Islam or Muslims in the region. And this JNIM is a confederation of Al Qaeda affiliates in West Africa, which is currently very ferocious. Then, after al Baghdadi declared his Islamic State, some people broke away from the JNIM and created Islamic State in the greater Sahel, which is more ferocious and more aggressive than Al Qaeda. And that is the status quo currently. They have taken territory in the Sahel and currently threatening littoral states or coastal states in West Africa, including Ghana, the country from where I speak, and other coastal states like Togo, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea, Senegal, and others. And currently, most of these states sit on tenterhooks in expectation of any attack that may happen. And in fact, global powers have assisted some of these states, but the threat still remains. And eventually, this has led to political instability, the return of coup d'etats in the region, because the military have used this insecurity as pretext to take over.
Yeah, Mr. Wusu, actually, I have a question about the particular. I was wondering if you could skip it, the coup part.
That's fine. That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah. So currently, the epicenter of global terrorism is in West Africa, because this is the timeline for how the situation has evolved to the current West situation we find ourselves in. Thank you, sir.
I'm sorry. So, out of curiosity, so you had the removal of Gaddafi, and Gaddafi had probably the most arsenal in terms of weapons since 1970. So therefore, when the country just bandwagon behind Iraq as becoming, and Somalia as an ungovernable state, and they joined the Mad Max realm, you had flow of weapons coming in from Libya all the way to the Sahel region. So what financial logistical networks sustain these extremist groups? And I guess how significant are their transactional connections between each other? Because you have the JNIM, at least for my readers, that means Jamaat al-Nusrat al-Islam al-Muslimin. Then ISGS, Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. Then you mentioned ISWAP, which was the Islamic State of West Africa province. But you also, I'm pretty sure you're going to mention later about the Katibat Mansina.
Yeah.
So, out of curiosity, is their connection very transactional, or there's an ideological bedrock between all those groups? But what is the financial logistical network?
Yeah, so Katiba Masina is part of JNIM. And ISWAP actually was the main ISIS franchise in West Africa before ISGS. And as we have known, most groups that want to get attention of ISIS do so by becoming more aggressive and more brutal. And over time, the ISGS became autonomous from the ISWAP, ISWAP. So ISWAP is currently based in the Lake Chad Basin, while ISGS is strictly in the Sahel. So, I mean, there's that kind of, they're able to demarcate territories for themselves, unfortunately. Now, with finances, as I mentioned, Akim has started with the control of smuggling, especially cigarettes, illicit cigarettes and other drugs, hashish and cocaine roots in the Sahel. And recently, these sources of finance have become very diverse. In fact, terror groups are controlling artisanal mines. Artisanal mines are mines that use rudimentary methods in extracting gold in the Sahel. And Sahel has so much gold in the Sahel. Mali, Burkina Faso, lots of gold deposits. And some of these deposits are on the surface. And so youth who are unemployed find ways and means, rudimentary ways to extract this gold. Now, this means that because the laws basically give resources, the control of resources to the government. This means that governments are always in this kind of coalition course with the youth that are mining this gold. And so JNIM have recently provided security to these youth in exchange for gold. And that is in the literature and is everywhere, and it's open source. Secondly, ISGS has also participated in this gold exploitation of gold. But another source of finance has been cattle. The extortion of cattle from nomadic groups or pastoralists. Now, as I mentioned, the main economic activity, traditional economic activity in the Sahel has been animal raising. I mean, goats, cattle, sheep, and things like that. And in the process, these extremists have exploited this economic activity, the cattle. So they extort cattle from Fulbe groups and other nomadic groups and sell them in coastal countries like Ghana, Togo, Cote d'Ivoire, and other coastal countries. Now, with that, it means they're able to raise funds. Again, these gold that are taken in the Sahel are sold in coastal states. Then there is the issue of taxation of the local communities. In terms of, they call it Islamic tax, even though it is illegitimate, they do that and impose on the local communities that they control. So people actually pay taxes to them. Again, there are legitimate traders. These legitimate traders who want to use the trade because they cannot stop their trade because of terrorism. So they still, move with their vehicles and their cargo. And these extremists also take monies from such supply routes to their benefit. So these are some of them. And again, sometimes they actually rob people, traders who are moving on highways. They seize government assets and things like that. So this is how they raise money in the region. Yeah.
I guess I'm going to touch point on the impact of recent coup and counterterrorism efforts. So we have seen recent military coups in Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and so I guess for my readers, Mali was overthrown by Colonel Assimi Goïta. In Niger, we had General Burhan Drani, who overthrew him, and in Burkina Faso was Captain Ibrahim Traore, who overthrew the government of Burkina Faso. I guess, so in terms of fighting against extremist groups, so are there long-term implications of military-led governance for regional stability and counterterrorism efforts in that region? And also, I guess a caveat to that question is, seen objectively, even though they are military dictatorship, all those three countries, the cynic in me would say also that Iraq under Saddam was under dictatorship as well. Gaddafi under Libya was under dictatorship. Syria under Hafez al-Assad, then afterwards under Bashar al-Assad was under dictatorship. And of course, minus Hezbollah, which was a transactional route in Syria between Iran in order to, as a passageway as a corridor. But relatively strong men tend to keep the relatively in power in check, but also there is one thing they hate more than anything else is religious zealots. So therefore, before the U.S. invasion of Iraq, extremist groups did not exist in Iraq. Al-Qaeda did not exist. And the same applies to Libya. Even I'm making another case would be Somalia under Saad Barre. After the absence of a strongman, you had Al-Shabaab playing almost as a state actor, because the government of Mogadishu only controls the city-state, and that's all. So therefore, do you think the military-led governance for regional stability will be a hindrance to counterterrorism efforts, will actually be a benefit?
Okay. So coups have not been rare in Africa. In fact,
Yes.
after independence in the 50s and the 60s, many of the first leaders or pioneer leaders turned these countries into one-party states. Now, with one-party states, there was no means of changing government except by the barrel of the gun. So the militaries tried to remove these pioneer leaders like or dictators in order to also have a feel of government, because they felt that they had monopolized power. And so we saw so many coups in the continent. So in the 60s, 80s, 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, coups were very common on the continent. Hundreds of them, failed coups, and tens of successful coups, counter coups, and things like that. Ghana had 5 successful coups and tens of unsuccessful coups. We had a coup in 1966, another coup in 72, another one in 78, then 79, and then 81. The last coup we had in Ghana, until the fall of the Berlin Wall, when we decided to go democratic, and ever since then we have not turned back. Recently, about 2 weeks ago, we had exactly 2 weeks ago we had our last elections, and the power transfer is going to be seamless because there's relative peace. But and the region after the Cold War, the region actually went democratic. We wanted liberal governance, democratic governance, participatory democracy. But with the extremism emerging in the 2012 and beyond, the Sahel militaries in the Sahel have often justified that, well, the civilians are not fighting extremism in the best way. They do not understand the security situation. In fact, they are not even prioritizing it. And so this has been used as pretext to take power. And it started in 2020 in Mali. Then in 2021, we had one in Guinea, then Burkina Faso. Then actually Captain Touare did not remove a civilian government or an elected government. He actually removed coup plotters or military government that had staged a coup to remove a civilian government. So that's for Touare. And then the very current one has been Niger. In West Africa has been Niger. That is last year, mid last year, when the generals took over in Niamey. Now the question is, how has the situation changed after this coup? And as you mentioned, where your caveat comes in, that, well, in the Middle East, we found that dictators have been more effective in eradicating or in even preventing a foothold in their countries in respect of Islamism or extremism. That is it. And however, in the case of West Africa, after the militaries took over, the security situation has really been worse. In fact, when the civilians were there, West Africa was not the epicenter of global terrorism. But it was after this coup that we actually came to have West Africa to be the epicenter, the current epicenter of global terrorism. So the argument that the military was going to be any different or was going to be more efficacious in fighting terrorism has not really stood the test of time, because it is not the case. In fact, internal displacement has worsened. Economic activity has been disrupted. Women and children are suffering, and that is the facts on the ground. However, we cannot put all the blame on the military, because the situation had started before they came in. But one thing is that with the coming in of these, or with the beginning of these coups, the region that has protocols for democratic governance has been on collision course with these military leaders. And because of that, regional cooperation that had started in the 2012 and 2013 has been halted. In fact, we had a J5 Sahel, where 5 Sahel countries brought their militaries together to coordinate and cooperate to fight terrorism. It has collapsed because Mali left the group, then eventually Burkina Faso and Niger has left. It is left with Chad and Mauritania. And recently, Chad also announced that it was leaving the group because it was a shell of itself. I mean, it could not stand. And so I think that the current situation requires more cooperation. But I think we come to the solutions later. So that is my position on military coups in the region.
Okay. I guess going to question number 4, the role of international players. I guess what role can international partners play in supporting fragile states without undermining the sovereignty and or fostering dependency, for that matter?
Thank you very much for this question. It's very important. Firstly, we have to go back to history again. Now, West Africa was dominated by the French. Much of the territory in West Africa was colonized by the French. And the French had, or France had, a very notorious colonial policy. And that policy was known as the policy of assimilation. Now, by policy of assimilation, the French were saying that, well, if you could speak French, if you could dress like the French, if you could speak like the French and, get educated or get French education or, yes, then you were qualified to be a citizen of France. So in that, with that policy, there were many Africans who were actually French citizens. And again, France saw its colonies as an extension of metropolitan France. That was very difficult. And that was why we had a very bloody civil war or bloody independence war in Algeria. Algeria was seen as a backyard of France. And it's more of its agriculture or its garden. And when the Algerians rejected that, it led to very bloody independence or war struggle. Then in West Africa, it was still the same. In fact, the current region known as the Sahel was actually treated differently from the coastal countries like Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire. So if you were living in a city like the capital, Dakar, the capital of Senegal, and St. Louis, another city in Senegal, you were likely to be a citizen. But if you were living in Mali, present-day Mali, you were not going to receive any education and you were more of a labor reserve for the coastal colonies. So from the word go, there was exploitation. But what is more interesting is that after independence, or as part of the independence arrangement, France did not really grant effective independence, so to speak, to its colonies. They arranged that, well, you are going to be part of the French community, and they signed deals that looked more exploitative. For instance, the colonies were supposed to keep, or former colonies were supposed to keep their foreign reserves in France.
It was again, colonial.
Yes, again, France was also having primary interest in the resources of these countries by law, that France had the first choice to reject or accept to exploit a resource before other parties could come in. That was exploitative as well. Again, there were so many. And there's an interesting story. When Republic of Guinea decided that it was not going to join that group or that arrangement, all the assets that the colonial government had given, or all the development that the colonial government had done in that country, were destroyed because they refused to join the French community. And this was 1958. Ghana actually granted Guinea 10 million pounds at the time, currently very huge money if you come to current value, at the time, for Guinea to survive. Without that, Guinea wouldn't have survived when it gained its independence outside the French community or the French arrangement. Again, if you look at the current Francophone countries, they copied the French Fifth Republican Constitution, hook, line, sinker. They copied everything. So it was very much influential in its former colonies, France. If you compare that with the Anglophone countries like Ghana, the Gambia, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone, that was different. Their independence were more or less more effective or more, real, or I don't know the right word to use. It was more tangible than what the French had, the Francophone countries had. And so the current situation where France has been rejected in all these countries has roots in history. So the military is able to exploit that kind of exploitation by France to its advantage by rejecting France. So Mali has asked France to leave its territory, the French forces to leave its territory. Burkina Faso has done same. Niger has done same. And currently, Chad has been the current country to reject France militarily from its territory. And even Senegal, where there is so much stability, Senegal has never experienced military rule since independence. But currently, it has asked France to leave. So many times, people, instead of talking about France, will try to put the West together. And I always say that it must be separated. The US never colonized any country in Africa. So in terms of the colonial project, the US was not part. And this difference was actually seen in Niger, where the Nigerians initially asked the French to leave without asking the United States to leave. But later on, when the US started talking about transition to democracy and things like that, the US was also asked to leave. So the most important thing is that we must always separate other Western interests in West Africa from that of the French, because historically they were not together. Thank you.
Yes. You're welcome. I guess just if my audience, what he was talking was that the United States doesn't come with the colonial package as the European countries do. But I guess there's a follow-up question to those questions as well. And in terms of we're talking about international partners, I guess you can see the resurgence of Moscow. We had a bipolar, then you have unipolar. Now we have a multipolar world, and you have the resurgence of Moscow in Africa. Currently, we have Moscow has regional influence. You can say so in Mali, Burkina Faso, the Central African Republic, Chad, Sudan, Libya, and Ivory Coast. And when you were talking about the Sahel region stretching from west to east, I think maybe the Russians were reading your analysis. But I guess going specifically to that question is, with Russia potentially losing its transit hub in Syria, how might this impact its ability to sustain operations across Africa? Because they have two bases. They have a naval base in Syria, Latakia, and also they have, I think it was Idlib, the air base. So therefore, currently they are more so shifting their gear from Syria to Libya. But I guess what implication would this have for African countries relying on Russian PMCs for counterterrorism and internal security?
Thank you. So I have written extensively on the Russian presence in the continent.
Yes.
And one thing that I have consistently said is that Africans have the right to associate with whoever they want. However, we must also objectively look at the kind of actors that are coming in. Because often people will resort to propaganda, exaggerations, and other things rather than looking at the facts. Russia actually came to West Africa first in in this case, in this context, I'm talking about the mercenaries, because Russia has always had diplomatic presence in Africa and West Africa. In Ghana, Russia has a very huge embassy comparatively with other embassies. It's a very huge building, and they've been around. Now, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Union collapsed. Russia's presence in Africa was not that pronounced. It's actually rolled back for obvious reasons, because it was more interested in what was happening in Eastern Europe, how its former republics are breaking away to form independence, and this will bring us to Ukraine currently. Now, that was its focus. So some embassies were even closed in Africa and things like that. However, it maintained very strategic partnership with countries like Angola, Algeria, which consistently became its largest arms supplier. Then we had Zimbabwe and other Soviet affiliated countries in those days. So Russia maintained contact. But in many countries, it had rolled back. Its significance was low. Then Putin took office in the last day of 1999 when Boris Yeltsin all of a sudden resigned. And with the coming in of Putin, there was more of a strong man who was going nowhere over time. We saw that. And eventually, Russia has sought to exert itself in the global politics. Now, exerting yourself in global politics naturally means that Africa will be affected because Africa occupies a strategic position. We have very important trade routes like the Red Sea route passing around it. It has a lot of resources. It has a population that is youth, which means huge appetite for consumption. It also has many countries, 54 countries, the largest for any continent in the world. So it means if you are in Africa, you are going to get diplomatic support. If you're able to get, so many countries in Africa, in the UN General Assembly and other fora, we are going to get that diplomatic support and recognition. We also have the situation of arms trade. So this means that with the growing population, it means that African militaries are expanding. And multiple threats means that these militaries have to be retooled or, equipped. And so Russian arms industry will also want to have a share of this market. So it makes sense that Russia will come to Africa. But after the coup in Mali, we saw the military junta approaching Russian mercenaries like Wagner to support it. Right from the word go, my position was that no. This is not about fighting terrorism. This is about regime protection. Because in the past, when militaries have taken over, they've had counter coups, which is either sponsored by or supposedly sponsored by an external power or someone else. And so they brought in Wagner to protect themselves. And I've always said that before I saw publications that were saying that Wagner is a regime protection organization, I had already said that. And the reason is that it was so clear that Wagner was more interested in what was happening in Bamako than what was happening in northern Mali. It was later, when extremists became more ferocious and were moving southward, that Wagner had to fight them in the north. And so far, that has not been effective. In recent weeks and months, Wagner forces have been killed, or fighters have been killed in Mali. And that is very worrisome. So back to Russia. Now, Russia initially used Wagner as a foreign policy tool. So in Central African Republic, in Mali, in Libya, and Sudan, Wagner was used by Russia as a foreign policy tool, providing security in exchange of resources. And they did not hide that. It was so clear. They signed deals that showed that they wanted to exploit resources. Now, this means that the use of mercenary as a foreign policy tool had become a new approach by Moscow, and it was less expensive. There's Prigozhin and others were making money while Russia was assured that it had influence in these countries. Then Ukraine happened. After Ukraine and the overstretch of the Russian military, which is so obvious, it meant that its presence in West Africa was threatened. But then again, the military would always rely on Moscow rather than the West because of their own protection. Because the West will always say that you have to hand over. We need a democratic dispensation. And they do not want to hear any of that. So they will prefer the Kremlin that will never mention democracy. And so the military has gotten closer and closer to Moscow for their own interest and not necessarily the interest of their countries. And this I have consistently mentioned. Now, with the overstretch, what it means is that with what is happening in Syria, it means Russia will have to change its approach or come to Africa. And so far, Khalifa Haftar will provide that kind of space in Libya, in eastern Libya, and in the event, Mali, Burkina Faso, and to a lesser extent, Niger are going to provide space if Russia wants for Kremlin to actually operate in Africa. In Central Africa, its presence is in no dispute. It is very expansive, and the kind of disinformation and misinformation that has been the center for such activities, Russian disinformation and misinformation. But then, as I've mentioned earlier, all states will have the right to choose their allies, but we still have to look at how we objectively analyze the roles of these allies. Thank you.
I guess in today's multipolar world, African states have many options for security, economic, and political partnerships. So excluding the United States, China, and Russia, which emerging countries could offer effective partnership for Africa?
Yeah, so we have what we call the new Cold War. And the new Cold War, many people believe, is between the Russo-China alliance and the West. And the West is seen to be largely led by the United States. And as I've mentioned, we must always separate, when it comes to Western interests, we must always separate what the US interest is from the European or the former colonial masters. Because the latter comes with some emotions and a lot of people who want to talk about history, the exploitation and things like that. But back to your question, we still have what we call the middle powers. The middle powers are countries that are emerging and are also, or emerging powers who are also interested in Africa. So we find some of them in the BRICS, the kind of alternative, global alternative, and global alternative to the West and other financial and political economic regimes. So we find Brazil, we find Russia, we find China, we find
Iran
South Africa, and then India. But one thing is that in your question, you have already taken China and Russia out.
And so also India, China, Russia, and the United States.
Yes, and the United States out. So India and Brazil are emerging powers that are interested in Africa. Then we have the Gulf states. Gulf states having so much capital and want to invest in Africa and also exercise some influence. So we know of the UAE. We know that UAE has interest in Sudan and is known to be supporting the RSF. We have the Saudi Arabia that also has interest in Sudan. It has actually provided good offices in Jeddah and other places for peace, just that it has not culminated into anything substantive. And then we have Turkey. In fact, the issue of Turkey is very phenomenal in that in the past decade and a half, Turkey has more than doubled its diplomatic presence in Africa. President Erdogan has visited more countries in Africa than any other leader outside Africa. In fact, the volume of trade has increased astronomically into the billions of dollars. And recently, we saw the Turkey coming in between Somalia and Ethiopia, and has even suggested to solve the situation in Sudan. In fact, these are the dynamics, the changing dynamics in the region. We also have countries like Iran that sees a lot of interest in Africa. Recently, before the late president Hassan Rouhani passed on, he was in East Africa and met countries, leaders like in Uganda, Kenya, and other places, and Zimbabwe, promising economic cooperation. Now, these middle powers, from what I see, are likely to gain from what is happening around the world, or the new Cold War, because many countries would like to shy away from being seen to be pro-Russia or pro-the United States or pro-China, but are more comfortable dealing with the middle powers because they are tentatively or they are perceptively seen to be equals. And so I believe that these middle powers are increasingly becoming influential in the region. Thank you.
Right, welcome. I guess the United States is going to have an election. Well, they're not going to have an election. It's already been decided, but they're going to have a new president come next month. And I guess addressing that particular variable in the equation. So, what steps should the United States take to provide a better value proposition in its engagements with African nations, particularly in the face of competition from other global powers and little global powers that you mentioned? Or do you, I guess, what is your opinion and framework and the next presidency? Do you think you're going to see a much more rapprochement with African countries, or is going to be much more isolationist stance?
All right. Thank you very much. One thing about President Trump is that he was once in power. And so when he seemed to be very unpredictable, but for analysts, the only thing or the only cue we can take is from his last time in office. Because then we can use that to see what he's likely to do. But then again, some people say that, well, the Trump in 2025 will be different. Because then, on the hand side, he's been in opposition for 4 years, or he's been out of power for 4 years, and perhaps might have revised some of his approaches. But the most important thing is that U.S. under Biden has made some investment in Africa, like the Lobito corridor, which is the copper corridor linking Angola with Zambia and the DRC and things like that. And in the last visit, he was accompanied by these leaders to inspect some of these huge multi-billion-dollar projects. Now, it will be difficult, knowing the kind of pro-business person that Trump is, to hear that U.S. has invested billions of dollars in Africa and then he would abandon it. It would be quite unlikely for him to abandon such investment. So he's likely to continue with that and perhaps look for alternatives to rake in more from such projects so that the U.S. would not be seen to have lost in the region. Now, to other areas, and I've mentioned it in my previous discussions, that in the case of West Africa, it depends on how his security lieutenants or his security advisors or team argue things out. If the argument goes like this, that Mr. President, if we do not do something about West Africa, the Sahel, we are going to have a situation where pariah states or failed states are going to create or breed terror groups that may affect us in the future, like it happened in Afghanistan when Al Qaeda found a foothold under the Taliban umbrella to operate and eventually hit New York and other places in the United States in September 11. If that argument goes well, Trump is likely to take action. Now, in the Red Sea route, where Houthis are increasingly becoming a threat to the security of the region, Mr. Trump is likely, who is also pro-business, is likely to challenge or to do something about the insecurity in the Red Sea basin. Now, in terms of resources, if Silicon Valley, because most of the rare earth, we have so many rare earth in Africa, we have very strategic resources like lithium and others that are increasingly being monopolized, so to speak, by China on the continent. If Mr. Trump feels that the competition is between the US and China, and which he largely thinks so, he's likely to invest more in resources in Africa. So I believe that, by and large, how Mr. Trump takes Africa seriously would depend on the argument put before him. Because from where I stand, he is not that sophisticated when it comes to foreign policy and long-term strategy. He feels that the US must be dominant, the US power must not be compromised, US must always gain from whatever engagement that it has. So where tariffs are necessary, he will impose it. Where he feels that he is going to gain, the US is going to gain, and he is very conscious about his popularity, or conscious of his popularity. So he's going to do things that the US citizens are going to see to be making sense to his election, or about his election, that, well, we voted for Trump for this and he's doing it. So African leaders, and I've said this consistently, that African leaders must, if they want to deal with the United States, they must psychologically study the leader they are dealing with and present to him very compelling cases or compelling argument that will enforce his argument. But then again, this means that a lot of effort must come from the African leaders, or the African side of the thing. But we have Russia and China that may not stress African leaders to that extent. And this can lead to US losing out in the long term. Because when I feel that, I have to put in so much effort to get closer to the US, and I also have Beijing ready to listen to me, then I might not go where I will be stressed out. I will go where I will have some convenience to deal with the leader. So that is the two sides. It's a two-edged sword. And so I think that, and depending on looking at the kind of or the people that he's choosing in his cabinet, I am more concerned. Because previously we had former military officers and military officers who, were very, I don't want to use the word level-headed, but they seem to have a mind of their own. But currently I see a lot of partisans being, chosen to fill positions, and I'm worried about that in terms of the US interest in Africa. But then, the sweetness of the pudding is in the eating. So when he comes to office, I think that there will be a way around some of these things. Thank you.
Okay. I think before we end this lovely discussion, and very informative, I want to address one country I was always been fascinated with, which is the economic and political hegemon of West Africa, which is Nigeria. So presently, Nigeria has the fourth largest economy in Africa. It used to be first, now it's fourth, and with 252 billion, and has the largest population by far. So one thing I never understood was, how is it possible that Boko Haram has been a significant actor for more than a decade in Nigeria? That is, I was not able to compute and puzzle that part, because so I guess, what is your assessment of the Nigerian military regarding military equipment, training, readiness, organization, and defense spending? Because technically Nigeria should be the military hegemon in West Africa and play a more significant role in regional defense, not only in Nigeria for that matter, as an umbrella. So can you give us a glimpse?
Yeah. So Nigeria has the largest population on the continent. It is the number one oil producer in the continent. And it has hundreds or tens of ethnic groups. So we don't have a homogeneous ethnic group in Nigeria. There are different ethnic groups with different aspirations. Religiously, the country is almost divided into two halves. Religiously.
Yeah, Christians and Muslims.
And so, that country is a very interesting country. Now, its position, the location of Nigeria, is a transitional territory. Because from Nigeria, you move to Central Africa. That is Cameroon. So it is a frontier state for West Africa. Again, it is also having access to the Gulf of Guinea, which is a very busy littoral area. And so that makes Nigeria very strategic and important. Now, with the military, Nigeria has the largest military in terms of numbers and equipment in West Africa. Over the time, Nigeria has faced multiple threats, and currently is so. We have terrorism, we have banditry, we have secessionism in the southeast, we have piracy, and other sabotage operations by groups that feel that the oil resources have not benefited them, even though these oils are extracted, or this oil is extracted in their territory or in their localities. So, I mean, diverse groups. And in fact, some time ago, kidnapping was also very common in Nigeria. Now, the question is, how could it have experienced all this and still become the number one economy in the continent? One thing is that despite what we talk about Nigeria, you are talking about the country with the largest population. So you are likely to have more, crimes happening. This is the country with the largest population. However, we are also talking about a country that has improved in terms of the provision of education to its population. So the large number of youth are being educated. We have very talented Nigerian youth. We also have a huge market. The population, this is an insatiable market. They have produced the richest, for a long time, the richest man in Africa, Dangote, who is, into the production of cement, production of oil, has produced the first privately owned oil refinery in the country. And this oil refinery is now exporting oil to other African countries and even beyond. We also have an industrial base that is expanding in Nigeria, and that is also adding, especially the service sector and the manufacturing sector. We have local car manufacturers in the country. Now, with this, it means that despite what is happening in the northeast by Boko Haram, the country is still moving on. Its security situation has been a little volatile, but the resilience of the people, the kind of the kind of consistency in terms of politics. Because recently, last year they had an election, and even though there were some dispute, there was a peaceful transfer of power from one leader to the other. This is becoming rare in Africa in recent years, and that is also positive. So the country is promising, and I believe that even though it has moved from the first position to the fourth in terms of the economic size, I see Nigeria taking over again in the next 10 years. It will take over because of its size, because of the kind of democratic path that it is taking, and things like that. Democracy is not the best, but I've not found a better alternative for Africans.
I agree with you 100%. But the
Because
question was,
one thing is that we have different ethnicities in each African country. Even in Somalia, where we seem to have a homogeneous ethnicity, we still have differences in terms of clans.
yes,
Now, how do you involve all these different groups in state building? It is through the democratic process. And so with Nigeria taking that path, despite its difficulties, the country will rise. And as I have said, it is one of the most powerful countries in Africa, not only in West Africa, because you are talking about Nigeria, you're talking about South Africa, Egypt, Algeria, and Ethiopia. These 5 countries, I have always said, should be allowed to lead the continent so that they create the necessary vortex that will pull others along. Because if African countries pretend that all countries are equal, it will be self-deception, and that will not lead anywhere. The size of the Nigerian economy is bigger than that of Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana combined. And these are the second and third economies of West Africa, respectively. So Nigeria is huge. So it will need the leadership. The provision of leadership is important. This does not mean that Ghana, my country, is not important. It is. But the reality is that Nigeria has a bigger economy. And if that leadership is allowed, it is going to create a lot of development for all. For instance, there is no railway linking Nigeria with the rest of African states. That is long overdue. There must be some sort of railway linking the capital of Cote d'Ivoire, Abidjan, with Accra, the capital of Ghana, Lomé in Togo, Porto Novo in Benin, to Lagos, the largest city in Nigeria, an economic hub. And this can lead to a lot of economic activities. And I've always mentioned this example. My mother was into orange plantation, orange. And we used to export it to Nigeria at the time. Now, when we load the trucks with the oranges, by the time they get to Nigeria, which is not far from Ghana, we will have about half of it rotten because they will delay it in the various borders. The border between Ghana and Togo, they will ask this truck to stay for days. The border between Togo and Benin, same thing will happen before you get to the border between Nigeria and Benin and Nigeria, where you still experience the same thing. Because somebody wants to take bribe, somebody will just delay you for nothing. And by the time you get to the destination, you've lost so much. Eventually, what my mom did was to cut down the orange trees and plant something else. So that was not encouraging economic activity. But you can imagine if Nigeria is made to lead and we are able to remove trade barriers, like what we are currently having the African Continental Free Trade Area. If it is made very effective, then it means that it's going to lead to collective development for all African states. So Nigeria will continue to be pivotal in the development of Africa, and its leadership, it will be essential. In fact, in the 80s and 90s, it was very instrumental in stopping the chaos in Liberia and Sierra Leone by the provision of forces. Ghana was actually a diplomatic leader, but Nigeria provided the numbers in terms of the forces to stop the chaos that was happening in Liberia and in Sierra Leone. So that is very important, and thank you for asking.
No, you're welcome. I guess, well, we have concluded with all the questions that we have for today. And I would like to thank you very much for actually being the first guest of the Nzuri Kahawa Report podcast. And we would like to have you in the future as well. And I hope to see you soon, sir.
Thank you very much for having me. I see it's a great honor to be the first guest on this show. And I hope that I have provided some or attempted to provide some solutions or some analysis on the situation in Africa. I would urge that anyone who receives this should try and follow you, because I know that you will have more resource persons on this show. And as we keep discussing Africa, we will find solutions to our problems and perhaps make sure that this century is the century for Africa. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, sir. And have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.